All right, everybody. Welcome to episode number 2 of the Vintage Spotlight podcast. This is a spinoff of the Vintage Spotlight segment from Sports Cards Live every Saturday night on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Vintage Spotlight itself is also available wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, and everywhere else. My name is Jeremy Lee. I'm the host of Sports Cards Live, the co-host of the Vintage Spotlight. Leighton Sheldon, my partner. Leighton is he's the owner of Just Collect. He is the host of Trading Card Therapy. Leighton, here we go, episode 2. Are you excited?
Very excited.
Want to thank everybody for tuning into the first episode. We've had great feedback, guys. Thank you so much. We solicited for some viewer questions. Now that we're in episode 2, now that we have some viewers, we're going to be doing a viewer question segment at the end of the show. We've got one for tonight. Thank you to everybody who did submit questions on the Instagram poll. And Leighton, let's get in and jump in. We have a bunch of things to get to. We have our first guest coming on with us a little bit later in the episode, Leighton. But first off, the first segment that we are going to touch on is key sales from auction houses or elsewhere. And Leighton, you've got some interesting auctions that have caught your attention. Why don't you jump right in and let's get right into it?
Absolutely. So for those of you that are not familiar, Memory Lane is another auction house in our industry, and they recently held an auction where amongst all the other great vintage cards they were selling, they did an entire set break, card by card, of every one of the 144 cards in the 1914 Cracker Jack set. And there's 2 particular cards that sold at auction that really caught my eye. The first one is a Shoeless Joe Jackson 1914 Cracker Jack in an SGC 4 and a Christy Mathewson 1914 Cracker Jack in an SGC 3. The Shoeless Joe Jackson sold for $90,967, and the Christy Mathewson sold for $145,906. And at first glance, you might look at both of them and say, wow, that's a lot of money for a couple cards that came with candy over 100 years ago. And it is. But as we take a deeper dive, believe it or not, I think, Jeremy, the Shoeless Joe Jackson, the price of it might have been a little bit soft, meaning I thought it could have sold for a little bit more at auction. And Mathewson, I think based on the research that I did, the price seemed quite healthy. So I was curious, when you look at those 2, if you took the deeper dive that I did, do you think that it's an anomaly? Do you think that if the Shoeless Joe Jackson was in a PSA holder, do you think that it actually would have sold for more? And I have some data that supports that if the Shoeless Joe Jackson was in a PSA 4, it would have sold for substantially more than the SGC 4 just did in Memory Lane.
That's a great question. My sort of perspective on SGC, PSA, it feels to me, Leighton, that PSA does command the most value across the board. But I'm going to actually flip this around back at you because you do follow this stuff closer than I do, especially these cards from the 1910s. Does the vintage community, the Cracker Jack community, do they equate a card, an SGC 3 to a PSA 3? My natural expectation would be that the PSA graded card would sell for more than the SGC graded card. But number one, I don't really think that's rational. All else being equal, if the cards are the exact same, then they should sell for the exact same, regardless of whose holder they're in, because buy the card, not the plastic and paper. But reality is different that sometimes than logic, and our hobby does attribute more value to PSA, at least in later decades that I'm familiar with. So back at you, were you surprised by that? And what do you think?
So you make some really good points there, Jeremy. And the first one is for those that are maybe listening to this and kind of discovering vintage cards with us for maybe the first time and diving into that whole sector of this wonderful hobby that we're in. Well, the reality of it is it's really hard to compare non-numbered, even though they're the same grade, cards from 1914 because they're never exactly the same. Whether it be it's a surface issue, it's a registration issue, the centering is just a little bit off. So even though a 4 is a 4 it doesn't really work like that. So especially when you're talking about a collector or an investor or a dealer spending tens of thousands of dollars, it's a little bit more nuanced. It could be at the time, Jeremy, and this is something we didn't talk about, timing. Meaning there was a certain collector who wanted that card in that grade for their set, and once they're filled, that price might change for the worse in the next time that card's offered at auction. And so in this particular case, I think it could have been that, and or the fact that even though I believe what you were saying, that if this card would have crossed to a PSA 4, it definitely would have sold for more money. But yet, if you look at some of the data that I looked up here, in July of 2022, which is just a couple years ago, an SGC4 of the Shoeless Joe Jackson from 1914 Cracker Jack sold for $120,000. It sold for $30,000 more. Keep in mind that, yes, the market was really hot a couple years ago, but right now there isn't much hotter than 1914 Cracker Jack Shoeless Joe Jackson cards. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then this is a really another great data point, because we always talk about this in our industry. No matter if you use, let's say, Card Ladder for pricing or VCP for pricing, you got to zoom out a little bit. So if we zoom out here, Jeremy, like a decade, in 2013, an SGC4 1914 Cracker Jack Shoeless Joe Jackson, you ready for this?
Yeah.
It sold for $16,590.
Oh my gosh.
So if you bought it for that, you're feeling pretty good about the $90,000 sale. So once again, it's always about perspective. And in this particular case, I don't know exactly what happened, but I did find it really interesting that as hot as Shoeless Joe is, and remember I had mentioned to you off air, but it's important to mention here, what really struck me is I myself, as the owner of Just Collect, actually purchased and sold at auction a 1915 Cracker Jack Shoeless Joe Jackson SGC2, so a little bit lower grade, but keep in mind, 1915 is much easier to find than 1914. I sold that at REA, Robert Edwards Auctions, in December of last year for $48,000. So when you compare the rarity of the issue and the grade, to me, that Shoeless Joe Jackson that just sold at auction should have been $100,000 plus.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Lots of great information there. And I made some notes as you were speaking, because there's a bunch of things that I want to address. First of all, you talked about timing. It cannot be overstated how important that is. When is the card being sold? When during the calendar year? Who's in the market for the card at that time? People are coming and going regularly. So you might have had two people that bid a card up to $130,000. Well, guess what? The guy who bought that card, he's now got his copy. He's likely not going to be in on the bidding action the next time the card comes up. So comps aren't always indicative of where a card is going to sell. You might think, well, the last one sold for 130. I should get 140 for mine. Well, you might get 110 or 120 because the guy that bid it up, he's out. He's not even following that card anymore. He's got his copy. The other thing is that, like you said, no two copies are the same. You got to zoom out. Sometimes you got to zoom in, actually, Leighton, and look at the cards. Don't just go by the numbers you see on VCP or Card Ladder. Look at the cards. Could be a vast array of eye appeals within an SGC3, a 3.5, a 4, PSA, all these things. So you might say, oh, that seems like too much for that card or not enough. Well, look at the card. Look at the card, everybody. That's so important. We are buying cards, not plastic holders. You also just mentioned, Leighton, the 1915 Cracker Jack. We were talking about 1914s. I'm aware, as you certainly are, that there was the 14 and the 15 set. Let's use that as a segue into the next segment of our show, which is deep diving into these sets. And you are the expert in the 1914 and 15 Cracker Jacks and the nuances and the differences between them. So I want to put it back to you, Leighton. Can you educate us a little bit on these two? I'm going to call them magical sets, because they truly are. These things are beautiful, and we're going to see if we can edit in an image of these onto the video version of this podcast. But back over to you, Leighton, if you can take us through some of these nuances between the 14 and the 15 Cracker Jacks.
Absolutely. So as Jeremy mentioned, the 1914 and the 1915 Cracker Jack sets are two of the most magical and iconic baseball card sets ever made. Keep in mind that when they were made, they were utilized to actually sell, believe it or not, more Cracker Jack product It had nothing to do with the cards. So that's what's so interesting over 100 years later. To talk about the differences between the two sets, first, the 1914 Cracker Jack set has 144 cards. The 1915 Cracker Jack set has a few more cards, and that is complete at 176 cards. But believe it or not, that is not the major difference. As we were just talking about the other day, something that you weren't aware of, and I think a lot of collectors are going to be riveted at this fact I'm about to share. So in 1914, with the 144 subjects in the Cracker Jack set, the only way to painstakingly complete that set back then was to get them out of the boxes one card at a time. And it may not seem that revolutionary in today's hobby, but in 1915, when they increased the set by 32 cards, they didn't just do that. They actually presented an opportunity, believe it or not, to collectors. And I use that term because I don't know what a collector looked like in 1915. But believe it or not, the first factory set was born in 1915, and that was by Cracker Jack. They allowed collectors to send in a certain amount of coupons from the product, along with the order form, and in return, you could order, believe it or not, a factory set of Cracker Jack 1915 baseball cards that would come complete with an album. And I believe, I was trying to Google it before today's episode, there was a major find of a 1915 Cracker Jack set, and I believe it was a few Cleveland Nationals ago. And this year's National, that's right, it's in Cleveland, Ohio. So is the magic going to happen again? I'm not sure. But the last difference I wanted to talk about with the 1914s, the 1915s, something that not a lot of folks necessarily know, is the 1914s, the cards themselves, they're just a little bit thinner than the 1915 version of the Cracker Jack cards. Therefore, they're even more brittle, they're even more condition sensitive, and the fact that they came with the candy that we all love with the caramel, and yet in 1915, you had the opportunity to get uncirculated, if you will, Cracker Jack baseball cards. The differences are night and day. So if you look at the pop report, in 1914 Cracker Jack, there is a total of 5,455 cards graded by PSA to date. Well, in 1915 Cracker Jack, just in PSA alone, there's almost 3 times as many cards graded at 14,544 cards.
So the 1914 is the rarer set, the tougher set. It's also the more brittle set. So they actually upped the quality in 1915. That makes sense. They were evolving. They grew the set as well, and they even evolved the way that they were distributing it, which is pretty cool. Have you ever seen the packaging or one of these original complete factory sets in the original packaging?
Well, I've seen the album before, and we're going to try for the folks who are consuming our podcast on video. We'll see if we can find something from Google. I believe that we'll be able to and share it. It reeks of the time period, Jeremy. It's just so innocent looking, but yet you know that if it contained the cards, you're talking about major, major dollars.
Now, Leighton, you deal with the gamut of vintage baseball and other sport collectors and owners of cards. Here's a question. The T206 set, very widely collected. The Cracker Jack set or sets, I feel like they're pretty widely collected too, but can you, just from your gut feel, what is the ratio of T206 collectors to Cracker Jack collectors? Do you have a feel for that?
Yeah, it's interesting, Jeremy. No one's ever asked me before. It's a great question. And the answer, which I'm going to give you in a second, is complicated. Because if you looked at some of the literature I was sending you on the Cracker Jack set before our podcast, part of the challenge with the Cracker Jack, if you will, issues gaining tons of momentum is in particular the 1914s. They're just really tough to find. And on top of that, they're really tough to find in nice condition. So it really complicates things in terms of, I think that if there was the same amount of supply and the cards were, readily available, I think there'd be more Cracker Jack collectors. But if you had to ask me how many people are actively completing an T206 set, versus a 1914 or even an easier 1915 Cracker Jack set, I might tell you it's like 50 or 100 to 1.
I was going to guess 50 was I thought you were going to say 50 and you did. That's interesting. And the Cracker Jacks, listen, the T206s are beautiful. Many of them are beautiful, the nice portraits. The Cracker Jacks, to me, are on a whole other level. I look at the Shoeless Joe Jackson card. I look at the Honus Wagner, the Mathewson, the Ty Cobb, and I'm just like, these things are like, to me, it's a dream to own one that is in nice, that has some nice eye appeal. They're wonderful cards. And I'm glad that I got to learn. I hope some of our viewers and listeners were informed here and educated on some of these nuances that they didn't know about. I certainly was. That's really great. Let's move into the next segment.
Before we do, I have one collecting tip about the Cracker Jacks. So I want to add this because this is complicated. Okay. The grading can be very inconsistent, which I guess isn't that crazy considering that grading can be inconsistent in general sometimes. But we'll get back to center for a minute. Here's the deal. A really great way to score a Cracker Jack. I'm not saying it's going to be cheap, but at a more affordable price. See, sometimes, of course, they're found that they were mounted in an album, they have some back damage. But keep in mind, sometimes a Cracker Jack might grade low because of the staining on the reverse that came from the candy. But the reality of it is, as Jeremy is saying, the front of the Cracker Jack cards are really what gets me. And to be honest, having a little bit of staining on the back just authenticates them even more that they came from the actual box of candy that some American likely ate over 100 years ago. And so to me, there are these little nuances, and I wanted to offer that tip as we have the upcoming National around the corner. Don't be afraid to look for ones and look at it and say, wow, the red's really bold. What's wrong with it? If there's something wrong with the back, you can only pray it's staining. That to me just makes it even cooler, and you're going to save a few bucks for your pocket.
I'm on the same page. I love staining on the back of my vintage cards. Like 51
Sure.
Bowmans have it a lot of the time.
Yes.
I love staining on the back of a vintage card because it just makes me feel like the card is au natural. All right. The next segment of our show we call Vintage Trends and Observations. Luckily, we're going to tie it into this theme that we've been talking about so far. And Leighton, you brought this one to the table this week, so I'm going to hand it back over to you and get ready to share some of this some very important information.
Absolutely. So the first thing I wanted to share with everyone is there's a place on the web. There's a website called net54baseball.com. It's a shout out to my buddy Leon Lucky. He is the owner of that website. And the website's been around for, I don't know, between 10 and 20 years, but is a wonderful, free vintage community that whether it be you have something simply to show off, whether it be you have a question about something you've never seen, or you have a question about something that's upcoming at auction or a card show, it is a wonderful community. And the reason I brought it up for today's podcast of the second episode ever of the Vintage Spotlight is because we're talking about trends and observations right now. And there was a wonderful post recently on net54baseball.com that had to do with an individual particular collector who actually not only consigned, believe it or not, some cards to memory lane, which remember we talked about some of those Cracker Jacks just a few minutes ago that sold in their auction. Well, this collector had consigned a number of Honus Wagner and Ty Cobb cards to memory lane's auction. But give them a lot of credit. They didn't just consign the cards. They sat down with someone at memory lane, a representative of the company, and they made literally 3 valuations of each card. So to be clear, for each card that he sold on consignment, he made a low column, a middle of the road estimation, and a high value. And as Jeremy's about to pull up the information, I thought, as even though I believe in general Shoeless Joe Jackson cards are hot, Honus Wagner cards have cooled a little bit, and I believe Ty Cobb cards have cooled a little bit even more. But rather than just talk about it, I thought, let's take a look at the data and give some credit to Rochkiss, a collector on Net54, who was kind enough to share not only the cards he consigned, but actually how they performed against the estimates. Now, Jeremy, if you'd like, I can continue from here, or would you like to talk about a couple of the particular highlights in regards to, let's say, some of the notes he made about the 8 Ty Cobb cards or a couple of the Wagner cards?
You know what? I mean, I'm going to let you address these notes, which I've shared on the screen now for people who are watching. If you are listening on podcast, Leighton will go through it. But one thing, that I do want to just sort of mention for myself is that as far as this being, trends and observations, high level, Shoeless Joe is hotter than usual, while Ty Cobb and Honus Wagner have cooled down. And this data here sort of backs that up, at least from this particular gentleman's submissions to the memory lane auction. And the interesting thing here is, Leighton, that players who've been dead for 100 years can get hot and cold, and that is because this is a trend. It's trendy. People, one person shows a great card, other people, they gain interest. Maybe they go purchase one, more demand increases the price, then they get their cards in their collection. They don't need one anymore. Like right now, I want to acquire a T206 Ty Cobb. So I will bid on a couple, drive up some prices along the way a little bit until I buy one, and then my bids will disappear probably forever because I don't need 2 copies. So trends are interesting because they're also based on people coming in and out of needing certain cards along the way. I'll just leave that at that. But let's, if you don't mind, Leighton, address some of this information.
Really glad that you brought up that point, because T206 Ty Cobb happens to be a relatively easy card to get. But as you get a little more nuance, for example, with Cracker Jacks, which are not nearly as easy to get, you bring up some great points there that even though there's supply and demand, when the supply is very limited and the demand drops off by just 1 unit, meaning 1 collector, that could substantially impact the demand for a future card to be sold at auction. So in this particular case, this collector consigned 12 Honus Wagner cards, not including team cards, to the last Memory Lane auction. He sat down with an auction employee for Memory Lane and created, as I just mentioned, a low, mid, and high value for every card consigned. All right, let's get to the data. The 12 Wagner cards finished 14.16% above their low value estimates, just 2.3% below the mid value estimates, and 15.4% below the high value estimates. And the reason why I think that's important is because if you had said 6 months ago or 9 months ago, I believe this collector thinks that all of these cards would have been above the high value estimate. And to be clear, this person is still a true collector, but like many collectors do, as cards, even vintage, believe it or not, get hot, folks will move out of some of them, redeploy that capital into other vintage cards that may not be as hot. And really, I've seen that done not only well, but time and time again. So the next subject I wanted to cover was the Ty Cobb cards. And I really appreciated what he wrote here, because, a lot of people, Jeremy, when they sell cards below, let's say, their estimates, they're not proud, they're not happy. But I really do appreciate what this collector did, because he's helping other collectors identify what's happening in the market. Maybe they now feel comfortable to go after a Ty Cobb card, Jeremy, because as you just said, you're looking for one yourself. If prices are down and I've been looking for a Ty Cobb card, maybe it's a nice time to buy one. Mm-hmm. So he says that he sold 8 Ty Cobb cards in that auction, and only 2 of them, that's really interesting, only 2 of the 8 even exceeded their low evaluation, with many finishing well below the low value. So if you just take that data right there, what he's saying is that Ty Cobb versus the Honus Wagner, his estimates for both, the Ty Cobb cards on average did well below the low estimates, whereas the Honus clearly performed a little bit better. And I thought that was really interesting to share with everyone.
Yeah, that is. And it's really nice to see such the amount of detail that this collector on Net54, who goes by Rochkis, that they went through the process of meeting with Memory Lane, coming up with their 3 different valuations, and then reporting back on it with percentages. That's not just someone off the cuff saying, oh, I think Ty Cobbs are down in value. No, they're bringing legitimate data. And so that's really interesting. I thank you for bringing that one to the table here today on episode 2 of the Vintage Spotlight segment. So, okay, good stuff, Leighton. Are you ready to move on to the next segment of the show?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So we do have several segments, everybody, that we are working through on our episodes of Vintage Spotlight. This is episode 2, as you know. but we're not necessarily going to address each and every one. So we're going to move into right now what we call fresh to market. This is where, usually Leighton discovers a collection or we hear about a collection through social media. But this one's interesting. And Leighton, this is brand new. Like, you actually had to reach out and say, hey, Jeremy, we gotta touch on this today while we record. So with that, take it away. Back to you again, Leighton. What is fresh to the market this week here on the Vintage Spotlight?
It is tough to be fresher than this, Jeremy, as this just literally came in. Now, to be clear, as most of the folks who are familiar with me know, I'm a vintage card expert. I'm a professional treasure hunter. I spend 7 days a week, 365 days a year, looking, dreaming, thinking about vintage cards. Now, as a collector, which I still am, I do collect cards, but I also collect old photos, autographs, and memorabilia, and it runs the gamut. So this individual reaches out to our company, Just Collect, and says, I'm getting married soon, and I'm helping my fiance clean up the family's belongings. And I found this really interesting, little shoebox, and it appears to be a bunch of autographs. And, at first you hear that, and you're like, great. Who do you have? So they purport to have over 150 Hall of Famers, some of the lesser known Hall of Famers, but still really cool, like Lefty Grove and Max Carey, and then some of the better ones like Dizzy Dean. And I'm going to save the surprises for when I show them on camera. So what's really interesting about autographs versus cards is I am not an expert. And even though I'm not an expert, I generally go with my gut in all facets of my life. And I've had these autographs before, and I think they're real. But just because I think they're real, and I want to make sure that this is clear to whether it be you're a collector, you're an investor, you're a dealer, Jeremy, I didn't try to be a hero with this collection. What I mean by that is I could have bought this collection from this woman for probably even less, lock, stock, and barrel, and taken all the risk of getting the top autographs authenticated. But try to treat people the same way I want to be treated myself. I want them to treat my son, my other family and friends. And so I explained to her, hey, just like I did to you, the audience listening to the second episode ever of the Vintage Spotlight, I said, listen, I'm not an autograph expert, but my gut tells me that these autographs are, in fact, authentic. So before I show them to you, what we explained to her is that, hey, we're going to get the best couple authenticated, and as long as they pass PSA authentication, we already talked about the numbers, we have a deal in place, and she said, great, I really appreciate you helping me out. So without further ado, Jeremy, I'd like to start showing off just a handful of the highlights of this incredible collection. So if you're wondering, folks, that's right. The first example I'm showing you is, in fact, Jackie Robinson. It says best wish. I don't think it says best wishes. Maybe that was a thing back then. But nonetheless, that is one. Now, the second one, these are
all for people who are listening, what Leighton is showing now. These are not autographed baseball cards. These are autographed index cards or a piece of paper, actually, with a simple auto on them. These would look great as cut autos if they were, inserted into a Topps card, for example. But please continue.
That's a great point, Jeremy. And so for those that are just listening and not able to look at this right now, this is actually a very common practice amongst really young baseball fans in the 1950s and 1960s in our country, where they would write the ball players. Some of them would write back, some of them wouldn't. But they were definitely a lot more innocent times back then, and certainly lower inflation. So anyway, getting back to center here, this is the first Jackie Robinson. You might say the first, well, Leighton, how many Jackie Robinsons are there? So get ready for this one. So this is super cool. This, for those who are not able to see it, I'm going to read it. It says it's on a little, it's not quite a 3x5 index card, but it's like a 3x5 piece of paper, notebook paper. It says, Dear Mr. Robinson, I would appreciate greatly if you would take time to autograph the included items. Thanks very much. And I don't know, it says best, I'm not sure the name, but you flip it over. I don't know if Jackie signed the other items, but I can tell you what Jackie did sign. He signed the other side of this note. Best wishes, Jackie Robinson. And so if that doesn't get you going, and I have goosebumps right now, there's actually a third Jackie Robinson 3x5 in this collection. But let me tell you right now, I hope you're sitting down. This is going to blow you away. This looks like a mint signature.
Wow.
Look at the quality of this.
That is beautiful. And you have the inscription as well. Probably my favorite inscription because it is generic and can apply to anybody. Best wishes. That is, Leighton, if anybody listening right now, I strongly encourage you to come to the Vintage Spotlight YouTube channel. Fast forward to about the 30-minute mark or so and check out what we are showing on the screen right now. That might be the nicest Jackie auto I've ever seen, Leighton. I think it is the nicest Jackie auto I've ever seen.
It's gorgeous. We're really excited to assist this particular woman and her family in the collection. We're going to show you just a couple more because we have a special guest coming up. So there are, believe it or not just 3 Dizzy Deans, but there's a few more that we didn't hold her, meaning put in card savers for this show just because we figured it was overkill. But there's over 150 Hall of Famers. And then just to finish out, there are 2 satchel pages. Gorgeous. Here's the first one. Now, the second one does look to appear to be done a little bit later in his life. Once again, I'm not an autograph expert, don't profess to be, but you can still see some consistency with both of those signatures. So this is what's really cool. Jeremy, now everyone is in it with me. I don't know if they're going to pass. I hope that they do, and I believe that they will. We're going to keep everyone posted, and as soon as we have the results, we're going to reveal them right here on the Vintage Spotlight.
Right on. Good stuff. Oh, man, those are that Jackie auto is amazing. All right. In the interest of time, we're going to move right into now our collector spotlight segment. We're going to bring on a collector who is newer to vintage cards, and I think he's going to provide a great perspective to our audience. If anyone listening or watching is wanting to get into vintage, this particular collector is going to show you that you can collect vintage, and a personal connection to what you collect might be the strongest way to really feel a connection to your items. Let's bring him onto the screen. Cory Smith, welcome to the second episode of Vintage Spotlight. You are the first guest of our collector spotlight segment. Cory, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Jeremy, Leighton. Thank you guys for inviting me to come on and share with you guys my journey in this hobby that we love.
Right on, man. Well, it's great to have you, Cory. I want to start by asking you and just connecting back to something we were talking about a few minutes ago when Leighton mentioned that the net54baseball.com website and online community is a great resource for collectors. You were listening to that, Cory. Is that something that you think could enhance your experience collecting vintage?
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I hadn't heard of it until Leighton just spoke about it. You know, I see so much of collectors on Facebook groups, but, you know, a place where it's dedicated to people that collect vintage baseball cards like myself. That's wonderful. So I'm definitely going to go in there, create my own profile, and get to searching for more of the cards that I like to get.
Well, let's talk about the cards that you like to get. So you recently got back into the hobby about a year ago, Cory. I know this. We've spent some time chatting. Mm-hmm. Why don't you kind of tell the audience and let us know what brought you back into the vintage section of the hobby, into the vintage segment, and you know, how did you go about launching your journey?
Well, what got me back into it was a coworker. We just started talking one night. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm into cars. My cousin's into cars. He has this big case and stuff." Like, you know, I was into cars back when I was younger, and so I'm in my 30s now and got a pretty good job with me. And so I was like, you know, let me go to the card shop, and I'm looking online at a few things, and I go get a pack, and you know, I'm opening up stuff online, and eventually I started doing these live videos with my wife, and she loves, you know, giving me a hard time during them. And if you ever see me on my profile, True Card Adventures on Instagram, you'll see us opening up packages that I get. And so, you know, from that journey right there, I was opening up cards and then showing them. And then a relative of mine was like, "Hey, you know, we used to have a relative that played in MLB." I was like, "What? Really? Who?" And the guy was like, my cousin said his name was Jim Gillum. And I had never heard of Jim Gillum. Never heard of him whatsoever. So did research and was like, okay, he played for the Dodgers. He's played in Dodgers in the 1950s. So I was like, wow, I used to play with Jackie Robinson. So I go to my local card store here in Indianapolis, and I just going through there, and I'll go to shout out to my guy Andy at Indy Card Exchange. They're great store, great guy. And
Great
I just
guy.
happened to be searching for a card, and I came across this one. Jim Gillum, 1960 Topps card. Just an absolutely amazing card. And I was like, wow. Like, I was just so stunned. It was like $1. All right. And I'm like, okay, now I'm hooked. So from there, I'm going, I'm looking for other cards online. I'll keep getting stuff. And then now it's turned into me having, like, I would say I have close to 25 of his cards now. And last year at the National, that was mainly what I was hunting for. And so I'm going from table to table looking for his cards. And sometimes I would get lucky and get one of his cards. Other times I would go through the whole lot, and they had all kinds of cards, but they wouldn't have his card in his lot. And it turns out, like, as I did more research, he was not only did he play with Jackie Robinson, he was the guy that really replaced Jackie at second base. But he played all over the field with the Dodgers in that time. He didn't pitch, he didn't play catcher, but he played all in the outfield. He played first, second, third, shortstop. In 1953, he was the NL Rookie of the Year, and his rookie card was the main card last year when I went to the National that I was searching for. And I found one card and it was miscut, and I didn't like it, but it was like, after going to 10, 15 tables of vintage stuff looking for a card, the more you strike out, the more you're just willing to accept what you find. And so the guy was wanting like 120 for it. I was like, I can't do it. It was raw. I couldn't do it. So I was like, I'll pass, buddy. I go to 2 more tables down. I get lucky. Guy's like, yeah, I got a Jim Gillum card right here. And it was raw at the time. It had a stain on the back, but I just loved it. He gave me a great deal on it, and I sent it off to SGC recently, and I got it back. It's graded and authentic. So, but this card is just absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And like the people that I've come across in this hobby that are big time Dodgers collectors because of guys like Jackie, Duke Snyder, Pee Wee Reese, Roy Campanella, a lot of those great Dodgers, Sandy Koufax as well. It's like, oh yeah, we're very familiar with Jim Gillum. He was a great player. He was the guy that helped them win 4 World Series. He was a guy that was an all-star 4 times. It's like, wow, I can possibly had this connection to him, and it's so cool. Like, he's from Nashville, and it's funny because I lived in Nashville, and I would go to this bar, like that was dedicated to him. Never knew it.
Yeah,
it's on a street that's dedicated to him. Never knew it. Never knew he was. Pardon me, because by the time I got in the car, I already moved back to Indy. So, like, he's from Nashville. My mother's side of the family is from Georgia, but their last name is Gillum as well. And so, like, I don't want to say it's that common of a nickname, but like, it's almost one of those things where he could be a distant relative of mine, but I just think it's such a cool thing, even if he's not, he still is. Like, this is my big cuz right here. Like, this guy played with Jackie Robinson. He was a Negro Leagues player. I just went to the Negro League Museum in Kansas City this past weekend and saw a lot of his cards on display, and they had a display talking about a lot of great Negro League players back in that time. And it's just really cool to see that and have that link to history. He played with the Baltimore Elite Giants, and it's interesting now since Baseball Reference and MLB has included a lot of Negro League stats. His Negro League stats now are on Baseball Reference. So he was playing professional ball at 17.
Wow.
That's crazy to me to think. 17 years old, out there playing with, all these legends that we see in the game in 1946. So that's just something that's really cool to me to have that. I just recently got his minor league card. This is a 1952 Parkhurst. Let me see if I can line it up here better with the camera. Yeah, 1952 Parkhurst. This was him when he was with the Montreal Royals. One of my favorite cards of his is a Red Heart.
Sure.
Very, very beautiful card. If you can see it there. Sorry, it's a PSA 3.
Cory, those are really cool cards. What I love the most about the story is that, your story, you come back into the hobby after, a colleague tells you he's collecting cards, and now you've dived right into a specific player. I'm sure you collect other things too, but that personal connection, or even the possible personal familial connection to a player, is driving you through. Leighton, do you come across a lot of collectors like Cory or any that kind of come in and find a connection, and doesn't it just warm your heart to hear him speak so passionately about it?
All of it does. It's been a pleasure getting to know you, Cory. And I would say almost weekly or every other week, we get someone on eBay who will say, hey, can you do any better on this card? And by the way, this person's my long lost cousin or my great uncle or whatever the case. And I never know if they're telling the truth or not, candidly. But I have to imagine Cory is not the only person who has either been kind of reeled back into the hobby, or there's a lifetime hobbyist or hobbyists out there that, because their dad used to play in the Cincinnati Reds, and even though he only got 2 at-bats in the majors, they're a lifelong Reds collector. Yeah. So I think, and this is why it's such a great guest for us, as our first guest, and I really appreciate your time, Cory, and being patient with us here on the Minute Spotlight, is that we could all be Cory, right? Jeremy, you and I sometimes, we're a little jaded. We've been collecting for a long time. I mean, I do this professionally. I'm still a collector, Cory. But we sometimes forget that there's, first of all, hundreds of millions of people that live in America. But of those folks, certainly a lot of sports fans, but there are thousands of people who've played professional ball. So their family and their descendants are somewhere. Yeah. And so I think that there's probably, it's such a great point, Jeremy, there's probably more family collectors than we think. They just may not make it public. They may not have an IG account like Cory. They may not have an understanding wife like Cory's wife who's willing to open up videos with them. So thanks for laughing, Cory. So anyway, I really appreciate the perspective of, hey, you're not someone who's trying to buy and flip, and not that there's anything wrong with that. You're not someone who's trying to look for necessarily the highest grade example. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You are truly in it for the love of what it means to you, your wife, and your collecting journey. And I am happy to have you part of our hobby family.
Yeah, this hobby has just been incredible. I started watching guys, Sammy Thunder on Instagram and YouTube, Baseball Collector Mike, Chris from Missouri, those guys. I watched their videos, and then last year at the National, I got to meet Mike and Chris at a trade night after the show. This hobby is just so interesting. And when you see how cards are packaged now, you got these hobby boxes, you go to the stores, your local LCS, and you get stuff, and that's very interesting. But like, I have these post serial cards. Okay, these are some of the hardest cards I've been looking for of Jim Gilliam's, and like, they came on cereal boxes. Like, you don't have that nowadays. There's cards that came on dog food, chewing tobacco, stuff like. We're not even talking about the T206s here that I love, and I used to own a polar bear. But like, this stuff from yesteryears, how they packaged cards back then and got them to the masses, is so much different than what we would ever see now. Like, could you imagine going, hey, I'm about to go get our dog a new bag of pedigree dog food, but there's a Shohei Ohtani autograph card. What? No, that so you cool. Would never see that nowadays. But it's so weird because like, you literally could have a Mickey Mantle card just like that. and that's like
on your cereal
was,
box. Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah, and it was a normal thing. Oh yeah, I got the Mickey Mantle for Jimbo's dog food here. It's just the craziest thing to think about. But like this hobby is just so incredible, man. Like I found like all kind of different brands. Like at first I only knew about the Topps card and the Bowman's card, but then I got into, of course, the Post cereal, the Red Heart, the Bell brands, the Parkers. There's a Gatorade. This is a Gatorade stamp card of his. There's a Wheaties card as well. There's an All Stars card from like 1955. I got mine on right now. It's just so many out there. A friend of mine has a couple of his Venezuelan cards. I'm not exactly sure if I want to go that route. If I want to try to track some of those down, maybe. But right now, I'm just mainly focused on completing the full run. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that here at the National. If not, the Cuban cards are probably going to be the hardest ones I'll try to find. But his team checklist cards or the team photograph cards, those are the ones that I need. I need one more post, and a Topps tattoo is another one I'm looking for.
Nice. Well, thanks, Cory. Listen, thank you for coming on, sharing your interest in our hobby. I love it. I love your passion, man. One of my biggest takeaways from having you on is that, it's not all about the GOATs. It's not all about Mickey Mantle and Hank Aaron and Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb. There are other players that are attractive to collect by many people, as Leighton said, in all of America. And I think that's just awesome that you can find pleasure in our hobby at a very affordable price when you're not talking about these top tier Hall of Famers. If you guys are watching on video right now, you're looking at Cory on our screen. You can see what he looks like. He will be at the Cleveland National. Take him aside, say, hey, I saw you on the Vintage Spotlight. Say hi to him, because we all love, well, I think most of us love this community. We want to meet more people, and that'll be your chance. Cory, I hope some people do say hi. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the National. I know Leighton is too. Want to thank you for coming on and being a part of episode 2 of the Vintage Spotlight. So thanks so much, Cory.
Appreciate it, gentlemen. If anybody sees me, be looking for me, look for the hat. The hat is my thing. So if you see a black guy wearing a white brim cowboy hat, oh yeah, that's True Card Adventure. That's Cory. Hey, come talk to me. I love to talk to people.
All right, Cory. Thanks again for joining us. We will see you. We'll see you in Cleveland in a couple of weeks. Take care.
See you, gentlemen. Happy collecting.
Same to you. Thank you. All right. Well, that was great. Hey, Leighton, what a great collector to have.
Great guy, great guest. Fantastic call, Jeremy. Speaking of community, as we're wrapping up our second edition of the Vintage Spotlight, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, but as I was doing my research on Net54 about a few different things, how cool is this? Just a random collector said, he didn't set the time and date yet, so if you need the details, go to net54baseball.com. I'm sure you can find the thread. He's like, hey, Cracker Jack collectors. Basically knows it's tough. He said he's organizing a meetup. Buddy of mine, his name is Al Crisafulli. He runs and owns Love of the Game Auctions, great vintage card auction house. He said, hey, look out. Let me know when we can all meet up. He's going to run a Cracker Jack meetup. And he said, bring your dupes. These are just collectors who want to help each other, whether it be they're working on a set or they just want a couple type cards. Believe me, if you can make the National Sports Collectors Convention, please try to say hi to guys like Cory. Of course, Jeremy and I will be there, and tens of thousands of other collectors will be there as well, all part of what we call a big hobby family.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. Okay, we're going to now move into our final segment of episode 2, and that is viewer listener questions. We solicited for them on Instagram the other day. We had several submissions. We've chosen one, and this is the one we're going to go with today. This came in from an account on Instagram called @Perimeter Collectibles. Want to thank that individual for sending the question. The question is as follows: should a player's passing, i.e., Willie Mays, rest in peace, impact their card values? This is a great topic. It's a great question. The question is, should the passing impact the card values? Leighton, I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to say yes and no. Yes and no. Yes, because they're in the headlines. Their career is being retrospected across various networks, across social media. and people get nostalgic and they say, he was a great player. He's now passed on. I want to add a card to my collection to remember this great man, the great legacy, especially if we're talking about a Hall of Famer, someone that is really noteworthy. And in this case, Willie Mays, certainly noteworthy for the past several years. He was known as the best living baseball player who is no longer active, I believe, maybe even active as well. So, I see why these values do change as a player passes away, but you have to be careful. This can be a trap for the collectors because it doesn't usually take too long. And I'm speaking from experience watching this market for over 40 years. It doesn't usually take long for those values to then come back to very close to where they once were before the player passed away. Those are my thoughts, Leighton. The question was not do they, it was should they? And that's an interesting distinction there. I'll let you take that piece on if you don't mind, and whatever else you'd like to say about it.
So I'm going to kind of leave what you said and let everyone know I don't know that I can say it better as far as the cards. But you put it very succinctly. He said, should it? And so I'm going to now, because we did talk about autographs in the show, should a player's death impact the prices of their autographs? Yes. And the reason being, it's very logical and a little bit morbid, is because there's no more supply. Only the demand will likely go up. The supply is now finite. And so to be fair, right, and I don't pay that close attention to Willie Mays autograph prices, but I have a feeling that if there was a bump in autograph prices, Jeremy, that's a little bit more difficult to contend with, to think that they're going to come back down to earth versus the cards. I agree with you. I think you're going to see a sudden spike because of the actual interest and whether it be ESPN or news outlets covering that person's career. But I think the autographs is a little bit of a different animal, and it's just something to keep an eye out for in your collecting journey.
Yeah, great. Yeah, well said. I'm glad that you took it to the autograph side. That's very important. And I think that will be slightly impacted by what is the volume or the population of, say, Willie Mays autographs in the market right now. Was he a notorious signer? Was he at the National every year signing hundreds or thousands of autographs? Is there a limited supply such that the now being finite feature of them would impact the values? And then there's a whole discussion we could have around the ethics of profiting or putting cards for sale of a player who's recently passed. There are communities out there that are really focused on a certain player, and if that player passes away, I've seen communities say no selling of cards for 2 weeks after this player passes away because they want to respect their hero. I think that's noble. Do I think it's a must do? Personally, no. I think that the world we live in, if you're Leighton Sheldon, owner of Just Collect, and you've got your inventory online, you've got a dozen Willie Mays cards, should you delist them because he passed away? I don't think. Now you're not allowing people to enjoy his cards that want to buy them. You're limiting their selection and maybe increasing the price there because supply comes down. That could be a whole other discussion. Maybe we'll have it another time. But we are past the time that we wanted to go for this episode. We're trying to keep these as short as we can to keep you guys involved and interested in what we're doing. I think listen, Leighton, this was a fun episode. I think we touched on a lot of great content, data. Cory came on and told his story. We saw your Jackie Robinson, your Satchel Paige, your Dizzy Dean autographs. We got to shout out Net54, which has been around so long as one of the just the most important message board communities in our hobby. Leighton, I think we got to end the episode right about here. I want to thank everybody for joining us and supporting the Vintage Spotlight podcast. If you are not yet subscribed on YouTube, please take a moment and do so. Leave a review, leave a rating on your podcast platform. That helps the show. We greatly appreciate it. I'm going to say goodbye now. I'm going to let Leighton say goodbye. Then we're going to play our outro, and we will see you guys next time. Go ahead, Leighton.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate each and every one of you for giving us a chance here at the Vintage Spotlight. I hope that we're bringing you some entertainment as well as value along your hobby journey.
All right.
Great.
I'm going to end the recording.